Welcome to the next piece in the hashtag Liberating Webinar series by the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network. Halito, Sahachifo yat Lexie Holden, Chatasia. Hi everyone, my name is Lexie Holden. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and serve as the Associate Director of Policy and Government Relations for the Intertribal Agriculture Council. My work involves supporting Native American farmers and ranchers and ending hunger across Indian country. I am a Native American woman with blonde hair, blue eyes, and am wearing a yellow turtleneck and large beaded yellow earrings by a Native American woman and friend of mine who runs a small jewelry business, Decolonized Beads. In the background, there are lots of bookcases behind me. I'm stepping in today to help facilitate this conversation and would like to thank Nancy and Lydia both for inviting me to this space. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you all, and before we begin, I'd like to make a couple of access notes. So to view captions, you can click on CC and then choose to show subtitle or view full transcript. If you choose show subtitle, you can click and drag to move the subtitle on your screen. And you can also access captions in a separate window using the link provided in the chat. Please let us know in the chat if you are experiencing any access issues, whether that be with captioning or interpreters or anything else, and we'll do our best to try and address the issue. So today we're here to discuss food justice and disability justice with Allilsa Fernandez and Tony Alexander. I'm going to introduce both of them, invite them to describe themselves, and then we'll also do a moderated discussion with some of the questions that we've got prepared. So let me go ahead and start by reading off their bios. So Allilsa Fernandez is a mental health disability activist and consultant. They have worked with companies such as Lionsgate, Facebook, and Verizon, and have volunteered with the Sylvia Rivera Law Project to work on TGNC shelter organizing, as well as the Met Council on Housing Justice. We also have with us today Tony Alexander, who currently serves as the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the Autistic People of Color Fund. A graduate of Northeastern University School of Law, he has spent the last several years working with nonprofit and community-based organizations, assisting with their advocacy, community engagement, and policy analysis needs. He has a particular passion for addressing food justice, disability justice, and racial justice. He also believes in using collective organizing and political advocacy through an intersectional lens as necessary drivers for bringing about radical, transformative, and scalable impact. Okay, so let's get right into this. So I have a food justice advocacy background as well, but there are some foundational questions that I would like to ask both of you, and thank you again for joining us today. After all, this is a conversation, and what is a conversation if not an opportunity to learn from one another? So the first question that I have for you, and I'll throw it to Tony first, is how would you define food justice? And yeah, let's go ahead and get started with that one.
Yeah, so when I think of food justice, I think of a framework and a grassroots movement that examines and aims to bring about equitable and accessible access to affordable food for all. And it really brings with it an understanding that marginalized groups, be it people of color, low-income communities, disabled people, have historically lacked an access to be able to produce, consume, distribute healthy and affordable and nurturing foods.
Excellent. And Allilsa, do you have an answer for what is food justice to you as well?
Yeah, so before I dive in, I'm a brown, non-binary person. I have short black hair, and my background is a white wall with a window towards my left, and I'm wearing a black hoodie with white spots. So food justice for me is basically everything Tony just mentioned. And in addition, focusing that it's healthy and nutrient, not just access to just any food, but nutritious food. So vegetables, fruits, things that are normally very expensive, especially for marginalized communities. So being able to have access, equal access to those types of food.
And Lexie, I forgot to actually describe myself at the beginning too, even though we discussed this.
That's okay.
Recording.
Please go ahead and take space now.
Yeah, I am an African-American man who uses he, him pronouns. I have locks that are black with a little bit of gray that go down to my shoulders, and I'm wearing a headband to keep the locks out of my face. And the headband is black and white with zigzag pattern. I have black glasses, and I'm sitting in a room that's blurred behind me. And I also have 2 Chihuahua mixes in the background that are out of sight of the camera, but you may or may not hear them barking and me shushing at some point during this.
Wonderful.
And I also want to add too, you know, a lot of people might have an understanding of food justice, but I think it's also important to talk about food sovereignty, which is a movement that's kind of like a subset within food justice. And it really kind of brings with it this right to be able to have healthy and nutritious food as well, but also culturally appropriate foods, and to be able to use sustainable methods for producing foods and maintaining our food system that we're in. And within food sovereignty, you definitely have much more of a commitment to addressing some of the systemic issues that are involved with our food system, like kind of undoing some of the issues that big agriculture and corporations have played within our food system.
Excellent. Yes, it's so important. Of course, I work across Indian country, and my hope is to see the end of hunger for all Native Americans across Indian country. And food sovereignty is, of course, integral to all the work that we do, and is so often also tied up in tribal sovereignty in my work, and just the recognition of Native American tribal nations as sovereign nations, and the importance of that government-to-government relationship that we have with the U.S. government. So kind of in this, keeping in this thread of food justice, food sovereignty, what are we actually doing? So how, and I don't know, Tony, if you'd like to go first because you're already off of mute, or Allilsa, if there's something you want to jump in on regarding food sovereignty as well. But I guess my second question would be, how do you incorporate food justice or food sovereignty into what you do? And also tell me what it is that you do. Like, what is, when you go to work or when you are out there advocating, what's the lever of change that you prefer to use? For example, I typically use policy advocacy and legal work. That's my lever of change. So what do each of you do, and how do you incorporate food justice and food sovereignty into that? Tony, would you like to start, or Allilsa?
Sure. To start off, I would just say that I wish I were currently doing more. I feel like I did a lot more in the past with regard to food justice, and I would certainly like to get more involved on a daily basis. But, in the past, I'm not a practicing attorney, but I did graduate from Northeastern University School of Law. And I went to law school with the intent of leaving with a career in food policy. And Northeastern is on a co-op system, on a quarter system, excuse me. And so during my second and third years of law school, I had to complete co-ops or internships at 4 different legal organizations. And all of the co-ops that I did were with environmental legal organizations, and I was focused on sustainability issues. So at one of the organizations, for instance, Conservation Law Foundation, they were looking to establish a legal food services hub so that restaurant owners, food truck vendors, et cetera, could come to CLF and really use them for any legal questions that they had on food-related issues. So if a food vendor was being harassed, for instance, about whether or not they had a permit or something like that, we would basically have laws compiled within the state of Rhode Island and be able to help them with whatever their needs were. So that was really fascinating. When I moved to Los Angeles, which is where I'm now based, I actually ended up initially getting a job on energy policy efficiency. So not really food related issues, but in my personal life, I've really made a commitment to try to focus on those issues. So from the time that I moved here, I volunteered with an organization called the Burrito Project, in which I prepared and distributed plant-based burritos to unhoused people in Skid Row and in Koreatown. And that stopped during the pandemic just because of health concerns. But even since the pandemic, I've been working with once a month, distributing food to insecure young people who are queer through an organization called Project Q here in LA. So I just drive around one Sunday a month, delivering food boxes to individuals like that. And in the future, I know that Lydia, the founder of the Autistic People of Color Fund, and I have discussed potentially doing some stuff around the intersection between disability and food justice through APOC.
Wonderful. And actually that'll be the question I come to next, but first I'll ask Allilsa. So Allilsa, how do you incorporate food justice or food sovereignty in what you do? And also, what is it that you do? How do you, what is the lever of change that you prefer to work with in your career?
Yeah, so I'm a disability and mental health advocate. And so food is mental health. And food intersects with disability, which oftentimes is forgotten. So part of what I do when it comes to food justice is discussing policies that are overlooked, especially in the time of COVID. So for example, the shelters historically has not provided accessible, nutritious food for folks. Oftentimes they give out moldy food, expired food, or they give out a lot of what we call junk food, very sugary, things of that sort. So during the pandemic, there was a lot of advocacy for supporting individuals in the shelter system that, this nutritious food were given out. So part of the folks who created mutual aids and were underground, we partnered with folks in the shelters, not necessarily the CEOs or executive directors, but more social workers or folks living there that we can talk to and communicate with. And we would say, hey, can you bring this back to your shelter? Here's a box of food. And this way we were able to provide food directly to the community in need, but also advocating for policy changes. One of the things that we advocated directly with the Department of Homelessness was more accessible food for different types of folks with different types of disabilities or backgrounds, because, for example, religion can play a part in the way folks eat, disability can play a part. There's so much to consider, but oftentimes folks are giving things with milk products or meat, and folks may not be able to have that, whether that's due to religion or disability or just what some folks call their lifestyle. There's a numerous reasons, and it wasn't accessible. So part of what I was doing was advocating, and ensuring that the shelters were more conscious and accessible towards food. And then another thing that we were doing, and by we I mean folks in the community who mobilized, like Tony mentioned prior, is a grassroots organizing. It's just folks in the community who get together and say, hey, things got to change, and it's going to change with me. So we got together and we mobilized boxes with fruits and vegetables and even farm-based food, like directly coming from the farm, not just supermarkets or agricultures, but directly from the farm. And then we distributed that into the community. And this was just another way to make that food more accessible. So those are some ways that I've been active with food justice. And then on my own, just on my own, I like to cook. I love to cook vegan food. So I normally will cook a nutritious meal for maybe 50 to 70 people, give or take. And either I partner with folks who are on the ground and directly take the food on one of the events, so it's directly going to folks in need, or I post on Facebook and say, hey, who wants to come over and grab a plate? And what that does is that not only does it make that food accessible, but it creates community. Because oftentimes, especially in COVID, a lot of people are feeling lonely. And if you speak about LGBTQ communities or the disability communities, that loneliness has increased because, for example, for the disability community, it might be that they are immunocompromised or have other disabilities that make them high risk for COVID. So I've created a system where they can pick up the food from my door, but I don't have no contact. And from the second floor, I open up my window at a distance. We're both wearing a mask, even though it's from the window. And we're able to talk and just say, hey, how are you? How was your day? What you've been up to? And this way is creating community. Or for the LGBTQ community, oftentimes families, their blood families have shunned them or pushed them away. And so grabbing that plate it's more than just food. It's building that community. Hey, you're not alone. We might have this social distance due to COVID, but we're here. We're a chosen family if that's what you choose to be.
Wonderful. Well, so since you've already started kind of weaving this into your answer, the next question I was going to ask about the intersectionality of food justice and disability justice. Do you mind saying a little bit more, especially, you know, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, really the importance of the intersections of those two things and how the sort of additional impact that COVID has had on, you know, communities who are disabled and folks who are disabled, and what food justice, how that could help, you know, mitigate it. Do you want to expand on that? And then Tony, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, sure thing. So this is Allilsa. Food justice intersecting with the disability, particularly, we saw that mostly in COVID. During COVID, a lot of people with disabilities, not everyone, but a lot of folks, they couldn't stand in line for long periods of time. And in the initial part of COVID, the supermarkets were letting in people a certain amount at a time. So the lines were around the block. And for someone with, let's say, a back condition or some type of leg condition, standing in line is just cruel and inhumane. And so that wasn't doable. And what we saw is that there was absolutely zero access to the food, because even though they were opening up, let's say on Wednesdays at 8 a.m. just for the elderly folks and people with disabilities, you still had to go in there, and folks were high risk. So you can't shop there, but you couldn't order food. The system for Amazon, because there was so many people, the system for Amazon was down, the system for Target was down, Instacart was down. And so the very few applications that did deliver to folks, they were down. And then towards the middle of COVID, we see that these applications start to pick up. But now there's another issue. A lot of them were not taking EBT cards. So folks who are highly marginalized, whether that's being poor or there's not accessible internet for folks to log into these apps and order, there was just barriers to ordering. And so that was something actually that we folks advocating on the ground, advocated for changes in who was going to take the EBT. Until this day, more applications like Amazon, Target, I think BJ's is taking EBT online, but not every supermarket. And that has to change. It has to be more accessible. And I think that was one lesson that folks learned during COVID. And then the other thing was the mutual aids that was going around. They were building up rapidly and food distribution was happening. But people with disabilities were being left behind. So food banks were distributing in person, but again, they weren't going to folks' houses initially. And folks didn't know what to do or who to call to bring the food to the home. So then towards the middle of COVID, they built up a hotline. And once they built up the hotline, it was horrific food. Again, sugar, candies, a bunch of bread which oftentimes was molded, cereal. There was like hardly any fruits, if any, or vegetables. And so even though they had created a little bit of access, meaning they were coming to the house now, they were dropping off food that people with, let's say, diabetes, for example, couldn't eat, or people with other restrictions couldn't eat. Until this day, that's still taking place. So there's still much work to do when it comes to access. And then the last thing I would say is shelters. Till this day, we're still fighting for accessible food. And by accessible food, I don't mean just nutritious, but taking into consideration that people have food restrictions and that different people eat differently, again, because of culture, because of religion, because of disability, and being mindful of those things. And oftentimes the shelters and even people who are distributing food don't think of that. And so then oftentimes people with disabilities are forgotten. They can't get a plate of food. If someone, for example, has a lot of acid, they might not be able to eat things that contain red sauce or heavy in acid with like lemons or garlics or things like that. So there's still a lot of work to do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your answer, Allilsa. And Tony, I'm gonna turn to you and ask now. So particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, how did you see food access and disability intersect? And what were some of the problems you were seeing? And I'll probably ask more about this later about, positive things we're seeing or models that we can bring forth with us into, COVID year 3 and hopefully into a post-COVID world as well for food access. But yeah, where did you see this intersection and what was going well, what wasn't going well?
Yeah, I mean, you really, Allilsa, made excellent points because, I mean, there were just so many issues around disabled people who are in shelters and in community living spaces, and their dietary needs were not being respected. And I just read an article the other day, and I tweeted about it, about how people who are incarcerated have a higher propensity of being disabled, and just the struggles that they're facing in prison, getting foods that they need. And there was one person who was featured who was talking about how he has Crohn's disease, which I also have, and how, there are just certain foods that impact his Crohn's and trigger that. And despite that, he still was not getting the necessary foods that he needed. And I think you have situations like that. I think it's also important to remember that disabled people live in poverty at more than twice the rate of people who without disabilities. And this pandemic has created a lot of economic, issues. People have lost their jobs. People are sick with COVID, or their family members are sick with COVID, and they are struggling taking care of them, and that really creates issues keeping up financially, right? And I think it's just been really hard to during the pandemic really focus on getting healthy and affordable food when you're focused on so many other things. And even outside of the pandemic, I mean, it is just expensive to be disabled. I mean, there are all types of financial, there are all types of things that you have to pay for, like mobility issues and stuff like that, that really cut into your budget. And it's just really hard to kind of get food. I do know that, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act was supposed to alleviate food insecurity for individuals. And when you're, talking about, some of the good things that have happened, there's been that. And I know that the USDA created a pilot program so that people could utilize their food stamps online for online shopping. Now, the problem is we're talking today about the intersection between disability justice and food justice, but we could have a whole nother webinar on the intersection between disability justice and internet access and the digital divide. And so I think it's great when USDA is kind of, for the first time, looking at ways that people could virtually buy food online so that they don't have to worry about going into stores in person if they're immunocompromised. But how do you deal with people who have limited or no access to internet? So you still have questions like that need to be answered and addressed. And I think that there are just still problems around that. And we really need to focus on expanding access to food stamps in this country and other social benefits. Absolutely.
I know that during the pandemic, many benefits offices for SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, moved to either by phone or online only interview processes, because in order to access SNAP benefits, you often have to go through a very rigorous interview and application process. And a lot of folks were unable to even access those interviews to qualify because they didn't have, enough bandwidth, enough broadband to be able to access the online portals, or they don't have a computer at home. I mean, there are, speaking, from the perspective of, Native American communities, we have communities across Indian country that still do not have running water, let alone any kind of internet access. So these are absolutely still there. Even though we've made some great strides, there are still pockets that we still need to access, and that there's more that can be done. And so with that in mind, I think my next question I want to ask is, and mutual aid was mentioned, online food purchasing using SNAP EBT benefits was mentioned, but what sorts of things did we see work well in COVID for disabled folks in terms of accessing food? What were some of the things, even if they weren't perfect per se, what are some of the programs that we want to continue to uplift in our work, both throughout the remainder of the pandemic and into the future as well? Kind of, a positive note maybe going forward. And I don't know if Tony, you want to jump in first, or Allilsa, either one of you.
Yeah, I mean, mutual aid for sure, hands down, has been a wonderful experience for many disabled people. I mean, I cannot tell you how many people just express their gratitude for the money that we're able to give to autistic people of color in need through APOC Fund. I also think, even just the smallest programs like allowing some of the immunocompromised people to go to the grocery store first thing in the morning, before it officially opens up. I think that that's been helpful for some people. Expanding access to different food delivery systems has been really helpful for disabled people. I'm happy to hear about, well, in a sense, I'm happy to hear about food banks expanding. I just read an article about how a lot of them are, building bigger facilities to handle. But I say, in a sense, I'm happy because it's depressing that we have so many people who are in need of food, right? Like, I wish that these organizations didn't exist. I wish we didn't have people who are food insecure. But it is great to see that in the scheme of things, you have food banks that are expanding services and able to feed more people during this time. And I think I've just seen more stories of individuals coming to one another's aid, to their neighbor's aid, and uplifting stories like that.
And Allilsa, I'll come to you with the same question of, things that you've seen that have been working well and that you would like to see be expanded upon, continue on throughout the remainder of the pandemic and in a post-COVID world as well, things that helped sort of increase food access for folks who are disabled.
Yeah, so several things. One, Tony just spoke on expanding SNAPs and the usage of SNAPs online and offline, because as Tony mentioned, that internet access is still a challenge. But if we can create spaces where it can be used more easily, that would be amazing, especially in farms and in places where they sell fruits and vegetables, because it's still, those places are still very inaccessible. The second thing is mutual aid, yes, has absolutely showed us that there's a different way to handle food. But again, in that mutual aid, people with disabilities were being left behind. One of the things that we learned in mutual aid together is when you're doing the questionnaires or when those phone calls are coming in, to really consider folks with disabilities. What do you need? It is very important to ask that question, or in another way, create packages that have accessible food, being very mindful, if you are going to distribute, for example, things that contain meat or milk or things like that, being conscious to package that in a very separate package, and even things that are that can cause allergy. Oftentimes I see peanut butter, they're thrown right into that package. And it's like, do you know that there's people that just by touching it, not unopened, they can have an allergic reaction? So being mindful of how you pack those things, being mindful that, folks who are vegan, for example, or that they're eating vegan meals due to disabilities, they don't want to see their stuff with meat and milk, just very separate. So being mindful of packaging, being mindful of how you do intake, shelters, again, being mindful of food restrictions and how folks eat. And then the last thing, two things I would say is love out here in New York City. I give a really big shout out to this organization called Love Wins Food Distribution or Food Pantry. They have done amazing work out here. We partner with them to distribute food to families and folks in shelters. And what they were doing is that they partner directly with farms and other folks distributing the big food, agricultures or folks growing the food. And this way they were able to distribute healthy food, vegetables, fruits, things of that sort. And the other thing is to partner with farms. That's the thing. Who are you partnering with? Partnering with farms, partnering with restaurants. A lot of restaurants were now partnering during COVID. For years, we've been advocating, like, don't throw out the food. I remember in our university, we had to fight so hard for them to see what we thought was common sense. Like, why would you throw out good food? We're not talking about expired food. We're talking about food that at the end of the day, you're going to throw away because it's not, quote, quote, fresh enough, but it's still great. So partnering up with restaurants was a huge thing now during COVID. And moving forward, we should do more of that. Partnering up with folks that do distribute. So like a lot of trucks and companies, they have foods that their cans got banged up, or they just didn't have space on the shelf. For whatever reason, is gonna go back into storage to be thrown out. But this is really good food. This is unexpired food that can be distributed into the community. So partnering in those ways. And then the last thing I would say is growing your own food and growing it in community. So out here in New York City in the Bronx, there are lands just to grow food. And this is specifically for Black and Brown folks that don't normally have access to land and access to growing food. You can join in for a few bucks. And there's even programs where you can join in with your EBT card. And it's more accessible. I mean, there's still work to do there, but it is more accessible. You can do a buy-in for like $3 a month or $5 a month. And once the crop is, done, so let's say that's lemons or avocados or mangoes, it will be distributed to you because you have contributed. But for marginalized communities, hey, if you can come together as a community and chip in for a land, which is what more folks are doing, buying that land so that you can produce your own food, that's also an amazing way to create food access. And this way too, you're taking off the labor and the abuse that's taking place in agriculture. So folks are getting paid like 30 cents, 60 cents a day, $1 a day. I wish I was exaggerating, but I'm not. And there's a lot of statistics out there where women particularly are being raped and molested, and all of these horrific things are going on there. No bathroom breaks, long hours. So, making that shift to find land together as a community and growing your own food is down the line going to take away from that abuse. And it's also going to nourish the community and empower the community.
Excellent. And because I am helping to facilitate this, I'm also going to answer my own question because I get to do that as moderator. And something that I would really like to lift up is the food distribution program on Indian reservations, which has been around for decades, but in the 2018 Farm Bill, there was a provision passed for 638 tribal self-determination projects. So while tribal nations are able to distribute the boxes, previously they were unable to control what was within the boxes. But there are now several pilot projects that have started taking place this year wherein tribal nations can actually choose what goes into these boxes. And so tribes in the Great Lakes region are able to put in wild rice from their local Native American farmer who's growing wild rice. Or in the Pacific Northwest, they're able to put in, wild caught salmon that is, part of a traditional Pacific Northwest tribal diet. And so it's a really important thing for food sovereignty in terms of, tribal nations being able to determine how they feed their citizens and being able to use these more traditional food items. But it's also great for supporting native producers and native farmers and ranchers, and that they now have, a very consistent customer base for these food boxes. And another thing, personally, my tribe, the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, these boxes, what they often will do is unpack them and have it in sort of a grocery store style where folks can go in with their shopping cart and shop for their free food items with all the same dignity that they would in a regular grocery store. They just pick out what they want. There are certain restrictions on how many of each item. They fill up their cart, get to the end, it's all boxed up. Someone loads it into their car. And for tribal elders or others who are unable to make it to these distribution, store sites, they do home deliveries. And for folks who live in particularly rural areas, they'll also do tailgating, wherein they'll load up a refrigerated van, drive it out, kind of a central location for many families who are very rurally located or remotely located, and they can come there to get it as well, or again, do the home distribution as well. So I think that's just a really important thing, and I hope to see the expansion of 638 authority as a way to increase tribal food sovereignty in Indian country and really have more control over how we choose to feed our citizens. So sorry, a little plug for some of my work, and just always happy to uplift the good work going on in Indian country. So I, of course, work in agriculture policy. Allilsa, you mentioned agriculture. So the next question I'm going to ask about is, what would it look like if we were able to grow more of our food in the future, if folks were able to grow more of their own things that they eat? And what might this look like? And I'll first start with Tony, if you would like to speak on this, and then we'll move back to Allilsa.
Oh gosh, I don't even know where to begin. But before I answer this question, I also want to, both of you were talking about the food distribution programs, and I neglected to mention earlier about, we talked about mutual aid, but community fridges have been a really wonderful addition. I think they're doing it in New York, right? But certainly here in LA, different communities are putting fridges out for the community, and they can just take what they need, give what they need, what they want to give. And that's been wonderful. And then I also thought of an organization here in Los Angeles called Superseed, SUPRSEED. And they are focused on essentially the same thing, creating like a kind of grocery system of products from local farms and Black-owned businesses, and allowing communities in South LA to be able to access that food. And so I wanted to kind of raise those two as examples that I should have brought up earlier. But to answer your question that you just gave me, I think, what would it look like, for communities to be able to just access, healthy food? And I think for starters, you can just look at what different organizations right now that are trying to create that are doing, and what that looks like. So there are a host of organizations in Detroit that are popping up with urban farms or urban gardens, and just in the communities where these urban gardens are, and these urban farms, it's connected people to the food that they eat. And I think it's, a lot of times, if you don't have access and you don't really know anything about healthy foods, it's a lot of people don't even know like what collard greens look like, or so it's connecting people to the food that they eat. And I think that it creates overall health and well-being, because you have access to this produce, to these vegetables, this fruit. I think it really teaches people how to cook, during the pandemic. Despite being interested in food justice, I did not know how to cook during the pandemic. And, I started myself going to different farmers markets and getting foods with my partner and learning how to cook food. But like, if you have a space where there are people growing this food and also educating people on how to cook with it, that, creates just a cycle of knowledge in and of itself. I think just system-wide, it can, you kind of alluded to it earlier, both of you, but it kind of cuts down on this global impact and these, like I was talking about earlier with food sovereignty, it cuts down on corporations that have just really infiltrated our society with processed, unhealthy foods. It cuts down on that, it eliminates that, and it allows us to just kind of create the food system that we really would like.
Finding that mute button is challenging sometimes. So, okay, let me look at my list of questions and see. We are coming fairly close to the end of time. So let me ask sort of I suppose, a big question. But so how can we bring food justice into this world that does harbor resources for only some groups of people? Already as individuals and for organizations and the organizations that we've named here today, obviously there's some great groups out here doing this work, but what more needs to be done? And I realize this is probably a taxing question since we're already doing this work, but perhaps it will inspire some in the audience listening. What can we do, and how can people get involved in this food justice work and in making this world a more equitable place? And Allilsa, I'll let you go first. That way Tony has a second to think about it. So I realize I'm asking some big questions, but.
That's all right. First, I wanted to acknowledge Tony. Yes, the fridges out here have been great. Folks take what they need and put in what they want to give away. Another thing is now Facebook groups. Right before things expire, folks offer it up and they say, hey, does anyone needs this? And that's amazing, instead of seeing it going to waste. I would say that we have mentioned a lot of the ways that this takes place. I did wanted to mention that from the agriculture perspective, it's again taking that power back. I think there's so much to be said about agriculture that we can't cover in this time, but I do want folks to look up at the banana massacre. When we talk about agriculture, what folks don't understand is the violence that has historically existed, that Black and brown people's land, this includes Native American, were ripped from them violently. There were murders taken away so that they can create profitable system. So when we talk about agriculture and planting as a community, it's reclaiming our power. It is not creating something new. It is not building something new. It is reclaiming what's ours, what has always historically been ours. Our ancestors farmed. Our ancestors grew crops. Okay, and for some folks, ancestors grew crops for other people's profit at their bodies crueling dispense. Like, they went through a lot of agony and pain for that. So I just wanted to say that about agriculture. I know, we can't dive into that here today, but thinking about community growing instead of individual growing, because we talked about how people with disabilities get left behind. And when we talk about individual growing, that's doing the same thing. You're leaving a lot of folks with disabilities behind, versus if it's a community, everyone can put in what they can put in. Maybe that's financially, maybe that's actually working the land, maybe that's picking up the crops, maybe that's packaging, whatever the case may be, and it helps much more community. So doing things like that. And I think right now, COVID has really created a lot of pathways that if we pay attention to it, we can build more sustainable food justice systems. So again, partnering with distributors, partnering with farms, directly with the farms, because when you partner with farms or you grow your own crops, again, you're moving away from that violence. You're moving away from what's happening in the fields. And when I say farms, I'm talking about small farms. I'm not talking about the farms that exist in Colombia, in Dominican Republic, in Ecuador, because there's so much violence there, but partnering with farms, local farms that that just local folks are involved with it. And there's even farms, I'll say this, in New York City, there are farms that do work with people with disabilities, directly with people with disabilities. So partnering with farms like that who, are working with people with disabilities, and that gives right back to the community as well. So those are the things I would say, besides everything we've already mentioned.
Excellent. And then Tony, how would you think that people can get involved in the food justice movement after this conversation today? And this will be our last question, unfortunately, because we are starting to run out of time.
Okay, just by wrapping this up, I will say that, you just want to look at the different pieces into how you are part of the food system. So you want to think about how you're a consumer. I think that I would hope that our conversation today would make you want to think about how you can change as a consumer. It might mean shopping at places if you can. And I recognize, like we talked about today, not every place sells food stamps, or there are access issues, so you can't always do some things. But if you can try shopping at locally places that have locally sourced food and that pay people well, right? There are certain apps like Instacart that Instacart was one of the big supporters of Prop 22, an anti-labor law that passed here in California. So if you can, maybe don't support Instacart because they don't really treat their contractors as employees. Thinking about it, like you were just talking about from an agricultural standpoint, yeah, that like food is violence in a way, because over the last several hundred years, African-American farmers have lost 90% of their land. A lot of that happened during, post-slavery, during the Reconstruction, during the Jim Crow era, but 90% of our land. And also Indigenous people, land loss is a huge concern. So thinking about ways that we can, one, acknowledge, but then you need to take more steps beyond just acknowledging the land loss, right? We should support organizations that are dedicated to food sovereignty and giving land back, land reparations. We should focus on growing our own food if we can. Obviously, not all of us have the space to do so, but it could be as small as like pickling in your house vegetables, beyond growing our own food or supporting community gardens, just thinking about what role we can play within society on a larger scale to make change. So you were talking about looking up the banana massacre, but you can also, if you're on Twitter, go to the United Farm Workers page. Every day they post pictures of people who are helping produce our food here in California. and the struggles that they face. I think some of them work 12-hour days and get paid $40 a day, you know, and it's terrible. But educating yourself about the struggles that people are going through who produce your food, and all of the different parts of our food system is essential. Education is knowledge, and we all work at the policy level, right? So we are pushing for different policies and programs that can create a better food system. But even if policy isn't your thing, voting for elected officials and political leaders, and contacting your current elected leaders to focus more on food justice and disability justice, and the intersection of food and disability justice, and making sure that they have that understanding and are working to do their job, fix these policies that need fixing, or completely recreating the system if need be. And so that's just what I will end on.
Wonderful. Well, I'm so sad to say that we are now out of time for our moderated discussion, but I would like to thank you both. Thank you so much, Allilsa and Tony, for sharing your insights on food justice and disability justice in their intersections. I think this has been such an important conversation to have. We've talked about mutual aid. We've talked about what it means to have equitable access to foods, and how that looks, you know, not just in the food justice space, but in the disability justice space as well. I've heard a couple calls to action for what we can do after this conversation to make our world a little bit more just in terms of food access. So I'm really excited about all of this today. And I'd like to thank our ASL interpreters. I'd also like to thank Nancy and Lydia for extending the invitation to ask me to help facilitate. This was a wonderful thing to be part of. And I also want to thank everyone else who helps to make these webinars happen. So we're now going to transition to the live audience Q&A portion of this webinar. So please, if you haven't already, go ahead and put your questions and comments in the chat if you have not already done so. And thank you so much, or as we say in Choctaw, Yakoke.